Yeah, there might be different devices also behave differently. So, so are you able to now see the full screen PowerPoint without the um,
Yeah, I can see the whole screen. Yeah, I can see that.
oh, is the PowerPoint in full screen mode, or you see the slide and the side
No,
menu and all that stuff?
I can see the full screen mode.
All right, great. Let's get started. All right. Sorry about that, everyone. So I'm going to talk about climate justice in India, and the title, if you see in the green highlight in the title, that's very deliberate, and it's very significant also. So I'm going to explain why that matters when we talk about climate justice for India versus climate justice in India. And that's an important distinction worth keeping in mind as we move forward. Um, so let me start with a little bit of a local context, and I haven't studied the impacts of climate change in Jammu and Kashmir per se, or even the social and economic impact in that context. But I know that this year has been shockingly a snowless winter in Kashmir, and that's for a variety of reasons that should just wake up us to this stark reality of climate crisis and how it's going to affect different communities and people. And of course, the impacts of climate change are felt all over. And even here in Boston, we are losing snow at some of the most fastest speed. We are one of the fastest warming regions in the world, even though when you live in a place that's really cold and has long winters, people sometimes jokingly imply as if it is even good. And jokes aside, there is something to be said about the fact that despite the often heard argument that this is a humanity under crisis, climate crisis affects different places, different groups, and different countries very, very differently. And that's the whole point of climate justice. But one big sort of cognitive barrier in understanding what is the distinction between climate change and climate justice is this notion of nature and nature's fury. So, this is a picture from last year's floods in Himachal, and every single headline that you would see would start by mentioning nature's fury. And what it does is, it directs our attention away from the root causes of climate crisis to focus simply on what are the symptoms of climate crisis. And that again is problematic because for people to demand climate action, they have to connect the consequences of climate change to the root causes of climate change. So in climate justice, we focus on understanding what are the root causes of climate change and who is responsible for the climate crisis, because that understanding is absolutely essential for beginning to solve or mend the crisis that is affecting us. Um, and often, and I'm sure you heard this, but the actors, whether it is the international community or the different communities within countries, the actors who are most directly responsible for climate crisis, they don't bear the most serious costs of the climate crisis. And this distinction between who is causing the crisis versus who's being affected by the crisis is really at the root of climate justice debates and discussions. More importantly, it's not just about climate change. Even climate policies have very different impacts on different communities, different regions, different countries, and so forth. And depending on what kind of solutions we look for, the solutions itself can create injustices of various types. And because of that, it's really important to understand who is shaping climate policies and programs. Because the kind of perspectives that get embedded within policymaking process, they have serious consequences for the nature of policies and program we think and we try to implement. So I'm sure there's one of the most long-standing arguments in global climate negotiation is the differential responsibility that countries have for causing climate crisis. So this is a um, graph from 2021, and it shows you cumulative emissions from 1850 to 2021. Now, you may ask why cumulative emissions, and that's because climate crisis is caused by not the present level of emissions, where sometimes you'll hear that China and India are the top among the top three emitters, but that's on an annual basis on the current timeline. Climate crisis is caused by historically accumulated emissions of greenhouse gases that stay up in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. Some of the longest lasting greenhouse gases stay in the atmosphere for several hundred years. Methane, which is the shortest term greenhouse gas, stays in the atmosphere for 25 years or so. So the current emissions will affect the future of climatic system and atmospheric imbalances, but the current crisis is caused by this historical emissions. And here you see that US is out of the chart. It just by far the largest contributor. US alone is responsible for about, depending on how you count, 30 to 45% of emissions. And then, of course, you have China, which has particularly added huge emissions in recent decades. And you have Russia, Brazil, Indonesia, Germany, India, UK, and so forth. Right. So this is and if you look at the remaining budget of how much we can emit, out of the total atmospheric sinks, there's only 14%, and this was 2021. So we already kind of probably close to 12% or something like that. Now, if you account for the fact that not all emissions coming out of a country are consumed by people within that country. So if you think about, commodities being exported to other countries, if you have manufacturing facilities in China or in other parts of Asia, those manufacturing units are producing goods for the foreign market. So the actual consumers of those goods are not within the same country where the manufacturing is happening. And so there are a variety of ways in which you can further deeply understand how the global relations affect the level of emissions, as well as who's actually responsible and who's benefiting from the processes leading to climate crisis. One recent development in this space has been to actually think about colonialism, because when British ruled India or other European countries ruled other parts of Africa and Asia and Latin America, and in the beginning, even the US, um, those again, what was happening in the colonies was conducted mainly with the perspective of benefiting the colonizers. You would have direct export of cotton and other kinds of goods from the colonies to the colonizers. And so researchers in recent times have actually reaccounted for those emissions, because just as we talked about in the context of exports, the colonizers also conducted a variety of manufacturing activities in the colonies, but they were done mainly to supply the global markets and markets in the colonizing countries. So if you take that account, the situation looks even worse in terms of how much the global north or the industrialized countries are responsible for the climate crisis. And that explains why countries like India and to some extent China, but mostly also other poor countries in Africa and Asia, have been making this argument that because you are responsible for a good chunk of greenhouse gases, almost all of it, if you account for the population figures. Remember the charts that you saw, they were not even accounting for the fact that India has 1.4 billion people, while US has less than 400 million people, right? So that difference would make those the differences of responsibility even more starker. And so that leads to this genuine demand from the global South countries or developing countries that the global North or industrialized countries should act on climate crisis because it's your doing. It's sort of what here in the people refer to this as the sort of the kindergarten ethic that if you make a mess, you clean after yourself. So that simple principle has been the baseline for a good time of the international climate negotiations, which started in the early 90s and have continued to this day. Um, the argument for international justice becomes even more stronger. So remember, we have walked so many different layers here. We've started with looking at the simple accumulation of stocks, then sort of thinking about all the exports and all the colonizing histories and all of that. You can add another layer to that, which is that if you think about the kind of impacts that will be felt in by the end of this century, uh, unfortunately, the tropics, where most of the formerly colonized countries are, they will have the most severe consequences of climate change. And this graph actually shows you the impact on percentage change in GDP. And countries like India will lose a huge amount of its productivity and GDP because of climate crisis. On the other hand, you'll see that most European countries actually, just purely in economic terms, they benefit from the changes in cropping patterns, the changes in seasonality, and those kinds of impacts. US kind of stays in the neutral zone where it's not harmed. Again, just purely speaking from an economic perspective, right? There will be human impact, and there'll be inequalities and all of that. So this recent study from 2022 actually argues that the 1.5 degree, once we breach 1.5 degree, and right now the estimates are that by the end of this century, we are more likely to hit 3 degrees of atmospheric warming. That will produce a world that is hugely unequal, and of course is hotter, and it's crisis ridden in multiple ways. So there are two things that are happening. You have this kind of global impact of climate change on everything, but because those impacts are related to these histories of inequality and exploitation internationally, it will also produce a more unequal world. Now, even today, we are at the historical peak of global inequalities in our history. And so, um, imagine what the world will look like if we go from here to become hugely more unequal, as the models are showing is likely to happen. Now, at this moment, let me pause for a second and see if you have any questions that were related to this discussion of international inequalities, because now I'm going to sort of make a switch to domestic inequalities, which is a slightly different topic.
Sure, sir. I'm just checking if there are any questions. So, sir, we don't have any questions at the moment, but we will definitely have some questions at the end of the discussion. But for
That's fine.
now,
Yeah,
we
sure.
don't.
I can continue. So pause for a moment and see how we have traveled from talking about nature's fury to sort of thinking about how historical and present day inequalities between countries are shaping these discussions and the way in which the impacts are being felt. Going from here, I want you to think about one more important concept that is often not clarified in a plain English, which is that when we think about inequalities, they're not just about impacts of climate change or even impacts of climate policies. The most consequential impact of inequalities is felt within the policy making process. So if you have a very small section of global society or national society influencing climate policies and programs, they are more likely to design those policies and programs in a way that benefits them. And this is exactly what has been happening in the context of global climate negotiations, where a small section of global community, which includes the rich countries and the fossil fuel corporations, have been able to capture the policy making process in a way so that we haven't seen a lot of action on climate change. If we acted in 1995, addressing climate change would have been a cakewalk compared to how difficult it is today. And that's not an accident. That's not a coincidental failure of the global community to reach an agreement. That's a symptom. The root cause, again, is in who's driving the strings of global negotiations. And I can go into this history if you want to sort of think more about it. But so the inequalities shape the way in which we think about climate change, the kind of policies and programs we seek to design, and how we implement them. This is also true within countries. So I am sure this audience doesn't really need to be preached about how unequal we are. But when we talk about India, the first question we should ask is this the India we are talking about, where of course these are Adivasis in forest areas. They are affected by all kinds of social, economic, political, cultural inequalities and exclusions. But we also have a very large section of population that lives basic subsistence lives. They don't contribute to climate crisis. But on the other hand, we also have a class of billionaires in India, dollar billionaires and super rich people. So top 1% of India's population has consumption that is comparable to the average global north consumptions or even above that, right? So again, I'm not talking about the super rich within the global north, but if you look at the super rich in India, their consumptions are comparable to above average levels of emissions in the global north. So we also always need to remember what slice of India we are talking about. So this India, and if you expand this to the lower middle class in India, we have almost 75% of India's population, which lives very climate friendly lifestyles. They contribute very little to climate crisis, but we have a small slice of society that is now competing with other global elites in terms of their emission profiles. And again, this is not these inequalities have not come about by accident. This has been driven by the kind of policy making process that we have seen in India. And so this table shows you data on income inequality within India. And if you look at the first column, the second column, which says top 1%, you see that the share of wealth that was concentrated in the top 1% population in India was going down from 1960 to about 1980s. And then it started climbing again, and it shot up remarkably in the 2000s. Similarly, you can look at the top 10% wealth, which was going down until about 80s and then started climbing up and has gone up very. And remember, these are pre-COVID figures. These inequalities dramatically increased again during the COVID years. Lastly, take a quick look at the bottom 50% of population. Its share of income was going up until about 80s, even 90s, it was doing okay, and then it has seen a significant decline. And if I remember the data correctly, about 2 crore people in India were pushed back into poverty as a result of COVID crisis. These inequalities are also directly connected to our emissions. So I have this very interesting chapter in the book that I published recently by Hemanti Bhattacharya at University of Utah. And her research shows that if you look at the state level income inequalities, right? So you're thinking about how unequal a state is in terms of its economic scenario. And if you correlate that with the emissions attributed to a particular state, in the pre-1990 era, if you had a poor state, it was also low emission state, right? So poverty leading to less emissions. That makes sense, right? If you and so But if you look at post 1990 era, which is the post economic liberalization era, a more unequal state in India contributes more to emissions compared to a relatively more equal state. And why would you think this kind of shift has happened, in terms of the relationship between economic inequality and the level of emissions at the state level? That's because since 1990, there's been a great deal of concentration of wealth and polluting industries in some of the most unequal states within India. And again, if you want to sort of get into the details of all of these, please do check out the book. And I'm also happy to talk more about it during Q&A. So the argument here is that poverty is not the biggest polluter, as Indira Gandhi said rhetorically. And we have an article recently published where we sort of, analyzed that speech and what it meant for India's policymaking and all that. But that aside, if we actually look at the data, it shows us that inequality is actually the biggest polluter in India, literally as well as metaphorically speaking. And so we ought to be thinking about the multiple ways in which economic, social, and political inequalities show up in the form of carbon accounting or economic impacts, but it also shows up in kind of the way in which climate policy making is designed. And I just wanted to briefly mention the discovery of lithium in Jammu and Kashmir. And if you remember those days, for days, Indian media was full of these nationalistic headlines about how now India is going to be among the top lithium producers. Point here is that yes, lithium is good. Having these stocks are wonderful, and there's a potential that we can make use of this incredible resource in the interest of the greater population of the state and the larger population of India. But that should not be taken for granted. Whether is resource is utilized in the national interest, it doesn't happen automatically. We'll have to design policies, and we'll have to uh, make sure that the mining is conducted properly. The local communities are included in planning for and conducting these resource minings. Um, Otherwise, if we don't plan properly, it will contribute to grave environmental impacts, and social inequalities will again go up because of the mining, because of how the activities affect different groups within society. So the point here is that nationalism can be good or bad depending on how you actually take the idea of nationalism and apply it in the context of policy making. And so this one article where we compared India, China, and Australia and showed how nationalism shows up very differently in different contexts. So the point being that so far the evidence actually shows that, if you look at how India has failed to implement the Mines and Minerals Act of 2015, which created these district mineral foundations that were meant to share the wealth from mining or income from mining with local communities. uh, so far we have really not been able to do that. And so it's actually a good time to sort of think about what does it mean to discover lithium in your state, and whether it is going to benefit the people of this state and especially the communities surrounding the mining areas, or it may actually leave the communities impoverished because it will affect agricultural land, it will affect water, it requires a lot of water, the processing of lithium and so forth. So the book Climate Justice in India, from where I'm drawing many of these arguments, reminds us that inequalities at every level, social, political, economic inequalities, they shape how we behave in the face of a crisis. So far, what we have seen is that Indian government has loudly proclaimed the demand for climate justice at the international level. But all the evidence that you can pull together by looking at economic inequalities, the instances of energy poverty, where households do not have enough resources to meet their basic energy needs, all of these indicators tell us that so far we have not done a good job of thinking about how climate change is affecting a large section of India's population. And if you needed a stark reminder of how poorly we are prepared, you can think about Joshimat, the town that has been sinking literally, and then all the landslides that are happening all over the Himalayas. And at the societal level, there's very little debate about what we can do so that we can preempt some of these crises. And then once these crises happen, how do we help the people who literally lost their homes and livelihoods and everything that they had? And these debates need to be brought up in the public domain. And it's the responsibility of all of us, but particularly for the young people who will shape our debates in the decades to come, to have this framework in mind that inequality is central to how we think about climate change, climate crisis, and climate justice. Um, COVID again was a big sort of mirror where we could look into how we behaved and how the society handled it, and that gives us a good way of thinking about what is the shape of things to come in future. So I'll briefly sort of mention some of the key arguments that have been made in the book. The book actually is open access book. So if you search for climate justice in India at Cambridge University Press, you can actually download a full PDF of the book. And so for students, you don't really need to spend any thing to sort of be able to dive into these analysis from some of the top scholars on the topic. We have already been debating urban climate responses for far longer than we have actually thought about climate responses in rural areas and agriculture and so forth. And Eric Chu, who's at University of California, and Kavya Michael, who used to be at TERI and is in Europe now, they have looked at the urban climate policy plans and urban climate policy making, and they show that urban climate policy making in India has been shaped by this faith in markets, private investments, and building infrastructure that is basically sort of a market view of society, if you see what I mean. And despite all the noises that you hear about, we thinking about poor people, in practice, they show by looking at the actual policy making processes and actual policy documents. In practice, urban climate policy has not really thought about majority of urban populations. Similarly, another chapter looks at the state of solar policies, and they show that we are trying to copy our current pattern of centralized grid structure, where the grids are now, in many cases, the electricity supply is managed by private corporations, and uh, again, that contributes to a variety of inequalities in terms of how affordable the energy is. And that's going to continue as our new solar infrastructure is being shaped accordingly, according to our current grid structure, which is centralized, large, difficult to manage, huge amount of wastes, and so forth. And so it doesn't look like we have learned from how we have handled um, our energy infrastructure in the past, which has led to a huge number of people still living in energy poverty, despite the fact that, of course, we claim that we are 100% electrified country now. Perhaps one of Perhaps two of the biggest problems that are least talked about in the Indian context is the water crisis and the heat shock that a large majority of India's population is going to experience. So, in one of the chapters, we think about intersectional water inequalities and water injustices, and we show how access to water is determined by the intersection of gender, caste, and climate change. More importantly, we offer a snapshot of an analysis comparing Uttaranchal and Gujarat. Gujarat is a dry land state, and Uttaranchal is, of course, very different agroclimatic conditions. And we show in that both these states, while they have very different agroclimatic context, the inequality in access to water depends on the same sort of intersection of gender, caste, and climate change. And we also cite research about World Bank programs and some of the top NGO-run water conservation programs, and the inequalities of caste and gender and class show up in all of those projects, which reminds you of the point that I was making earlier, that inequalities of various types shape everything that we do in the society. And unless we have thought about and deliberately addressed inequalities within the policy process as well as implementation of the program, those inequalities are going to continue in within our climate context. And so Shrilata Sarkar, who's at the King's College London, she argues that in Indian context, we have to reimagine climate justice as caste justice. This is a very powerful chapter. Again, I've engaged in the writing process throughout for all the authors, but you should definitely check out some of these very exciting contributions. So to come to sort of toward and I'll probably conclude in about 5 minutes so that we can have about 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A. A big sort of part of the ongoing narratives about climate change is that we need to plant trees because remember, trees suck carbon dioxide and they have many other benefits. And so, what better solution to think of than these nature-based solutions, which is true. Biologically speaking, trees do absorb carbon, and so you can have this basic argument is all right. But not all trees do all the things equally well. You have local indigenous species that are adapted to the local ecological context. They are also adapted, local communities make a variety of uses of indigenous species because they've lived with these species and these forests for a very long time. But very often what we see is that when large-scale tree planting schemes often plant fast-growing, industrially valuable species that are of little use to local populations. And they are bad for the environment because it's like, you're planting a tree species that doesn't really belong there, but you're planting it because it's easier to plant, easier to manage, and it's easier to exploit in commercial interests. So a few years back, we published this paper, which has been, it's sort of, gone viral in some ways. It's being cited almost every day. And these were the starting sentences of that article. Scientists, corporations, mystics, and movie stars have convinced policymakers around the world. It may actually also be the other way around. Policymakers have co-opted all of these people to do what they want to do anyway. Policymakers around the world that a massive campaign to plant trees should be an essential element of global climate policy. And we show in this article that that's actually not so simple, right? Because, what tree species, under what kind of ecological conditions are you planting trees in desert? And then you're killing the desert ecosystem and you're changing the conditions that the flora and fauna in the desert ecosystem are used to. You're also disconnecting by planting exotic, fast-growing trees. You're also taking away the kind of trees that local population can make use of. So we brought together a group of ecologists and biologists and social scientists, all kinds of people, policy people from different regions of the world, and we presented a very accessible way of sort of thinking about why we need to think deep about this kind of tree planting bandwagon which is being created. And that reminds me of sort of thinking about ecology and society. These are not two separate spheres. In agrarian societies, including India, communities have always adapted to the local environment. I come from Rajasthan and Western Rajasthan with very little rainfall. And we in the entire history of the region, no one remembers anyone ever dying of thirst, or even dying of hunger, because whatever little rainfall we got and whatever little wild vegetation we found in the desert areas in Rajasthan, we used it to the best possible ways. If the famous kersangri vegetables, they are dried wild fruits, which we preserve and save for the rest of the year. So the point is that once you start thinking about climate change as this kind of technocratic, infrastructure oriented science thing, you forget that the impacts of climate change are going to be experienced at the intersection of ecology and society. It's not about building walls and building dams and building electric vehicles and those kinds of things. For a large majority of population, what really matters is how they engage with ecology. So I'll kind of conclude with this very powerful statement by Disha Ravi, who I'm sure all of you know, especially the young people. She works with the Fridays for Future India, and she has been jailed for her climate action, for her activism. And she says, my grandparents who were farmers indirectly birthed my climate activism. I had to bear witness to how the water crisis affected them, but my work was reduced to tree plantation drives and cleanups. Remember, these are catchy slogans that catch the attention of the middle classes and upper middle classes. They like it because it doesn't upset their consumption patterns, which are important, but not the same as struggling for survival. Climate justice is about intersectional equity. It's about being radically inclusive of all groups of people so that everyone has access to clean air, food, and water. As a dear friend always says, climate justice isn't just for the rich and the white, and you can add that it's for the powerful caste and people in India. It is a fight alongside those who are displaced, whose rivers have been poisoned, whose lands have been stolen, and snows have been stolen, who watch their houses get washed away every other season, and those who fight tirelessly for what are basic human rights. We fight alongside those actively silenced by the masses, and portrayed as voiceless because it is easier for savarnas to call them voiceless. So the book also highlights the kind of solutions that we should be thinking about, and we one of the chapters looks at women's collective land ownership and collective agricultural practices promoted by state policies in Tamil Nadu and Kerala. And that is a great example to see how talking about these broader effects of climate change doesn't mean that we are going out of control. That if you put some people will you'll hear them arguing that if you put everything under the umbrella of climate change, how are you ever going to solve this, because it's so unmanageable. But the problem is that the root causes as well as impacts of climate change will have to be addressed at that intersection of ecology and society. There's no shortcut. If you take shortcuts, then you will address climate change for a very small slice of society while letting a majority of your population be devastated because of these kinds of impacts of climate change. So, as Baba Sahib Ambedkar said, and this is a artwork from Dr. Nitin Donald, who's and these artworks are also included in the book. There's poetry that will make you think and sort of connect to your soul, and there's artwork, powerful artwork, inspiring discussions about the already ongoing movements and these kinds of policy initiatives. So I'll conclude that by reiterating that thinking about climate change in terms of nationalism may be helpful in the context of these historical inequalities and contemporary inequalities that I talked about. But singing the slogans of nationalism is not going to address the impacts of climate crisis on a large majority of India's population. And we ought to be rethinking the ways in which we make our policies, the way in which we think about climate crisis and climate justice. um, and so that's the basic argument, and I'm happy to take any questions that any of you may have.
Right, yeah. So we have few questions over here. One of them is, what are the potential economic benefits of transitioning to renewable energy and implementing sustainable adaptation strategies to mitigate the social and economic impacts of climate change?
Sure. So the first thing I will say, thank you for your question, and you're thinking about all the right things. But transition to renewable energy will make sure that we move away from fossil fuel based power sources, which is, although the timeline and the scale at which that needs to be done have to be thought through very carefully, because right now we are still drawing a huge deal of our power from coal-fired power plants and other kinds of fossil fuel generated power. But again, when you're thinking about questions of adaptation and mitigation, I think it helps to think in plain English or in plain Hindi or plain Urdu, whatever you're comfortable with, to think plainly about what are we actually talking about, because sometimes these phrases can hide rather than revealing the kind of challenges that we need to deal with. So in the context of development of renewable energy, again, Rajasthan happens to be one of the largest sort of states where, you've seen big, very big developments of solar power. And I've seen how that can affect the local ecology and even sections of local populations. All of the lands that the power solar plants are being set up in Rajasthan, many of these lands used to be community common lands where you would have local community members grazing their livestock and earning their livelihoods from it. Um, and so uh, the ways in which renewable energy transition may allow us to adapt to local impacts of climate change will depend on whether we are thinking about renewable energy in this sort of a holistic sense, or we simply are thinking about the molecules traveling from solar panels and windmills to our appliances, and just as a plain source of power. If we take that kind of a reductionist view of renewable energy transition, we may be able to make the energy transition, but we will create huge ecological impacts on the way. And we will also end up hurting local communities and thereby creating new kinds of injustices on the way. Uh, you know.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you so much for your answer, sir. So concretely, as we talked about the fact that in the starting of the presentation, that who is responsible for the climate crisis and who is getting affected by it, and then gradually we observe that there are people from rich class, and then there is another section who are not contributing to it but are getting affected by it. So considering that factor in mind, I would like to ask that what are the concrete effects that are affecting them in terms of climate change? Whether they are vulnerable communities, or whether they are low income groups or tribal groups, Adivasis. So, what are the concrete effects on them because of the climate change, specifically to India? So,
Right. So, one of the important things to consider for, again, when we think about the majority of population in India, which relies on the use of local natural resources, whether it is agriculture, forestry, uh, pastures, and, livestock keeping for, herders and migrant herders, or fisheries for fishermen communities around the country. All of these livelihoods are delicately designed in a sort of multi-optional livelihood portfolios. Think about if you are a finance student, if you have a set of funds and you want to minimize your risk while maximizing the returns, you want to distribute your financial resources across different kinds of portfolios. marginalized people's livelihoods are managed exactly like that. They've understood the risks of relying on a single source of livelihood, so they diversify, they rely on different niches. And in fact, if you think about the migrant herders, their whole migration patterns are designed to be able to tap into the availability of grasses and other kinds of natural resources during different seasons in different parts of the country. So in that sense, when you have drastic changes in rainfall patterns or seasonality, it's very difficult for the smallholder populations to adapt rapidly to these kinds of drastic changes, because these adaptations work in over generations. They work on a generational time frame. And so that's the first thing we ought to be, whether it's the apple grower who, I really haven't studied so much the apple growers, but I don't know to what extent there are smallholder apple growers, and whether these apple growers are rich farmers who can adapt quickly. But you can think about anyone who lives at the subsistence level, they can't adapt, and so their livelihoods are being affected in terms of the patterns of rainfall, the intensity of rainfall. That reminds me that oftentimes you will see data about the amount of rainfall, and people will look at variation in more or less rainfall. That's actually not how agriculture works, right? It's not about the amount. You have a big amount of rainfall falling within an hour, you'll destroy everything. It'll cause soil erosion and so forth. And so the point is that it's the seasonality, is the way in which people make use of natural resources. That is one part of how climate change is affecting the poor people. The other important, remember when I was talking about water, I mentioned heat, and I haven't talked about it because we actually, unfortunately, could not include a chapter that was going to be focused on the heat stress. But my friend and collaborator, Dr. Deepak Malgan at IIM Bangalore, has been working on this. And he's an engineer, so he also brings in concepts from thermodynamics and all of that. And he argues that heat crisis is going to be the most serious of the impacts of climate crisis, which we haven't started thinking about. And so again, if you think about anyone who's working outside, whether it is farmers, whether it is daily wage laborers, construction workers, and that would include people working on constructing climate-related infrastructure, those are all the people who will either work under extremely excruciating conditions day in and day out, or many of them will actually lose their lives because the kind of heat that we will see will be simply um, um, unmanageable. Human body cannot adapt to that kind of combination of heat and humidity that we experience during many parts of the year. So I would think about agriculture or natural resource dependence and the heat impact as the two biggest, including the water impact on water, access to water, and drinking water in particular.
Thank you, sir, for your answer. It was quite insightful. Also, there's another question from the audience, and they asked that how is the climate crisis going to impact conflict and peace in South Asia?
Yeah, that's a very important question and a very serious one. So there are two layers of this security question that I want you to share with you. Um, One, there are actual geostrategic impacts of many of the climate related impacts. So in between India and Pakistan, we have transboundary water sharing arrangements. And you've heard politicians from time to time sort of coming up with threats to stop, water flowing from India to Pakistan. So that's one type of political exploitation of natural resources, control over natural resources. And similarly, China um, there are discussions about how China controls river flows into India and Bangladesh and so forth. And of course, its occupation of Tibet is another big climate change related thing to consider because Himalayas and the glaciers are often referred to as the third pole. It's an important source of water for a huge parts of South Asia, and so it has huge security and geostrategic implications. That's one part. The other part um, is that many in the industrialized countries are they want to securitize climate change so that they can create this can make this issue into a question of military responses, because securitization relates to the 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 potential threats of civil unrest and those kinds of things. The social science research on this topic about the link between impacts of climate change and the potential for civil strife is very mixed. It's a very complicated link that need to be understood very, very carefully. Oftentimes, simplistic links are being made in the interest of making this whole climate change issue into a security issue and into a military issue and relating it to literally into the transactions around weapons and wars and military technology and those kinds of things, military bases and all of that. That's dangerous. I won't go into the details, but in the paper that I showed you about climate nationalisms, we show how the securitization discourse has been appropriated by a section of global industrialized world, especially the security industry, military industry, to promote this kind of narrative around securitization. But the third and the most important part of security angle is the human security angle, which is completely different from the military security angle. The human security angle sort of relates to the ways in which different groups in a society experience water insecurity or energy insecurity and other kinds of livelihood, precarious livelihood kind of issues. And so that broader frame of human security, which includes other kinds of security threats, but it doesn't focus predominantly on military and war and international crises. So that would be an appropriate concept to sort of engage with and understand. And if you are an international relations student, there's also a new journal of human security that you should check out. I think they do really incredible work, led by in my friend and um, Ashok Swain, who is at Uppsala. So, yeah, so the frame of human security can be extremely productive in this context.
Thank you so much, sir, for your answer. The other question is, uh, like, how can we kind of bring equality or kind of aware people about the sustainable climate, policies, and like basically, so the question says it's a little bit of complicated, but it says that how can we work to bring equality or aware people get get everything to have that kind of solution.
Right. This is a unprecedented challenge for Indian society in particular, because our society is founded on various kinds of inequalities of caste, of gender, of class, regional inequalities, all kinds of. I mean, if there were a world headquarter of inequality, that would be India by far. I mean, nobody can match us in terms of how different types of inequalities intersect and reinforce one another. And these inequalities have been mainstreamed. They've been institutionalized through, if you look at, I'm sure you've seen reports of who is represented on the editorial boards of all the main media houses and in the corporate world and in the higher education. Our social inequalities are reflected in everything that we do in India. And so it is nothing short of dramatically transforming our society from bottom up. And I say bottom up deliberately, despite being a political scientist, because addressing inequality will not be done by people at the top because it serves them. It's not a bad thing for people to be leading an unequal society. It's much easier to control and exploit an unequal society than it is to control and exploit an equal society. So it will have to happen from the bottom up. It will have to happen through people's movements at all levels. But then it's not just about people rising up on the streets. People will have to federate. They'll have to connect across regions, across scales. So you'll have to have local movements plugging into state level movements, which then plug into the state level, national level movements, and they have to make it politically costly for India's politicians to fail to address inequality. And that's easier said than done. Right? So only when we can force the political and economic elites in India to do something about vulgar inequalities that exist in India, I think we will have a really hard time dealing with all of the other problems.
So when we talk about urban planning policies, are we looking at the kind of structures that are made, the kind of, the architecture and all of that, and not just related to one section of the population? Because then we cannot ignore the other section of the population, as you said, the other India. So are we looking, when we talk about urban planning, are we looking at that?
So we've done some research on India's smart city program, and it's a very long discussion. So I'm afraid we'll have to keep it very brief. But smart city is a good example of how the rhetoric of smartness and inclusivity is, I would say, almost abused. We have all of these things sound really nice. You have these awards, and there's almost like a city level nationalism where cities compete against one another in the clean city campaign or whatever. But if you look at the investments that are happening through the smart city program, um, remember there's a recurring theme throughout my talk that when you talk about justice, it doesn't just have to be about morality and ethics. If you are a somebody who wants to look at the evidence, please look at the evidence. But evidence needs to be read clearly, and it needs to be understood in a particular context. So you go and look at the kind of investments that are being made in different smart cities, and you'll see that smart city investments are often targeted at a very small portion of the city. It's either the inner market area or the riverfront development. They'll have one shiny project. Every smart city will have one big shiny project. There are very few cities. I think Bhubaneswar has developed a program to track stormwater, the level of stormwater, so that you can predict if a locality is going to experience flood at certain level of rainfall, right? So that's one example of how you can think about smart city at a scale that will affect and benefit the majority of population, right? And if you again, it's easier said than done. If you think about how our cities are, large areas of slums and very densely populated communities where you don't have the space to manage stormwater, or there's not even proper channels and so forth. um, and so because of that, it's challenging, but you can think about how we can imagine the kind of solutions that will help us address the consequences of climate change in a way that is beneficial to a majority of population in urban areas. And that, I would say, is not happening everywhere. Bhubaneswar, in that sense, and that one particular project I really like, and I'm not sure to what extent if this is being implemented effectively. But you see the point that these are the kind of examples that we should be thinking about and seriously developing. And if you are a young IT person or a young policy person, that's where you should invest your energies, because then you can serve a very large section of our society rather than working for, putting up solar lights in parking areas. Only about, depending on what city you are in, 5 to 10% of a city's population uses parking lots. And so you put up solar lights in parking areas, that's good, right? But it's going to affect a very small section of the city.
Also, sir, as you said, I think this is rather a question. I think this is something to take notice of it. And I don't know if I'm wrong. Please correct me if I'm wrong. That as you said that, in India, when it comes to the solution, one thing needs to be kept in mind that India, it is divided into a lot of states, and every state has its own season. So it is diversified. So is it possible for the government to kind of tackle with climate change, having different policies for different states when it comes to climate change? Because it makes sense, as you said, that we cannot follow the traditional concepts of our solutions of climate change. So how do you look at
Right.
it?
Right. We are an unbelievably large country, especially if you consider the population density. So I often do a comparison with US. If you do land area to people density of populations in these two countries, you get a ratio of about 1 to 20, 22 or 21, something like that, which means, for the same amount of land where you'll have one individual here in the US, there will be 22 people in India. And so to our credit, I mean, despite being such densely populated country, we still manage somehow, right? That's great. There's a lot of jugaad, and we could do all kinds of things that help us. But being a big country also means governing in a decentralized manner. Even our states, you rightly pointed out that central government cannot design all the solutions sitting in Delhi, and all the states should have autonomy to develop their own plans and policies. But I would go one step further and say that most of our states are larger than most of the European countries. And so, even at the state level, we need further decentralization of decision-making power, of resources. Cities in India cannot collect their own taxes. Their taxes are sent to the state exchequer, and which prevents them from productively utilizing those resources, which they could. Of course, there can be corruption at the local level, and so you'll have to have an organized and well mobilized civil society to monitor what happens at the local government level. But corruption cannot be an excuse to not decentralize, because corruption exists in a big way at the state level and at the national level too. So that kind of cancels out. Every level is corruption is vulnerable to corruption. So we have to think about the idea of decentralization that our founding fathers were already thinking about, and we have to actually take it way beyond what we already have in terms of the three-tier structure of local governance and urban municipal body management and authority, and make sure that citizens have the ability to influence how urban local bodies are spending their resources. As of now, there's very little transparency. The average urban resident in India knows nothing about how the city government is spending its resources. Sometimes some of these cities have borrowed millions of dollars of rupees from multilateral agencies, and then of course the cities have to pay that back, right, at certain interest level. So um, there the local people should be consulted in designing and planning for these projects before you borrow huge amounts of money that the local community will then be paying through different kinds of taxes. And the one last thing, it's really important to mention, there's a confusion about income tax, and sometimes you'll see these social media posts about, I pay my taxes, and, I demand this and that, which is fine. But remember, you're not the only one. If you are a salaried employee, you pay income tax, that's great. But you're not the only one paying income taxes. Recently, there was a report, I think in the Hindu, which mentioned that the poorest people actually pay a very big share of the all kinds of taxes, sales tax, and those kinds of local taxes. And so everybody pays taxes, and the local governments as well as the state government should be accountable to the people who are paying those taxes.
Right, right. With this, maybe government could reconsider looking at state, concurrent, and central list to maybe reconsider putting climate in the state list. And with this, I would really like to thank you, Professor Prakash Kashwan, on behalf of JK Policy Institute. So I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to our esteemed guest, Professor Prakash Kashwan, for sharing the insights on climate justice in India. And I think the book you have authored, The Climate Justice in India, could actually help academia, researchers, and students to further carry on research on different intersectional subjects with respect to climate change. And also, I think I would also like to say thank you to you to kind of present climate change in a sense that how real it is and how the climate crisis is making existing inequalities and injustices a whole lot worse. So, thank you so much for that, and thank you so much for taking time for all of us. I would also like to thank all of our all the questions which has come, which actually all the audiences they posted to us. So I would like to thank audience for taking out time and being just being with us. So thank you so much for that.
Of course. And I should mention that all of the authors and myself, we worked really hard to try and make the book as accessible as it can be. And then, of course, we spent huge amount of time and energy to make it open access. So please do check out the book. It is especially good for, if you're in a think tank or you work with all kinds of policy engagements. You can look at how different sectors are not just being affected, but how some of the potential solutions can be thought about. So please do check out the book, help spread the word, and more importantly, start thinking about how we act collectively as a society at the local level, at the state level, and so forth. And so please feel free to reach out if any of you may need additional help or any resources. I'm always Google me, and you can easily reach me on the university. All the best.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. Thank you. And end the